What is up guys, Blue Spooky here with a 2-hour Megamix. That is 2 hours of new true scary stories to this channel, as much as I'm able to track. If you guys enjoy this long video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. Doing all of those ensures I can keep making daily videos for a long time to come, especially these longer ones. If you guys have any thoughts about the stories in this video, please be sure to leave them in the comments below, as one of my favorite parts about doing this is reading your guys' comments, even if I don't always get the chance to reply to them. Without further ado though guys, I will let you enjoy the next 2 hours of true scary stories, and I will see you again at the end of the video. Thanks for watching. This was a few months ago while driving for DoorDash. I only drive as a side gig, maybe 10 to 15 hours a week or so. This night I was only filling a couple of orders since it was already late. I had picked up a smaller order at around 1 a.m. or so. It was supposed to be delivered to a business building somewhere across town, which was apparent by the address I'd been given. This was a normal thing, usually for overnight workers or whatever. When I pulled into this parking lot though, it was completely empty. There were no cars at all, and it didn't look like there was a parking lot behind the building for more to be either. I parked in a spot near the front of the building and got out with the food. The place was definitely an office building of some kind, and was much smaller than most I'd seen. Being only 2 stories and not very wide at all. All the lights were off in the windows. Aside from a single one behind the front door. I walked up to the door and checked the app. Seeing it had specific drop-off instructions, they said to enter the main hallway and leave the bag outside of room 232. I looked through the door into the building, seeing the hallway filled with a bunch of closed doors on either side. Delivering to specific rooms I'd only done at hotels before, so this was kind of a new experience for me. I tested the front door, pushing on it, and found that it was unlocked. I stepped inside. I expected to hear people working, moving around, or talking, but instead there wasn't a single sound throughout the entire building. Only the white noise from the overhead light buzzing above me. As I passed by the first few doors, I could see they were all numbers within the hundreds, 102, 106. The room the instructions had said to leave this at was in the 200s. I assumed that meant it must be on the 2nd floor, somewhere toward the center of the hallway. I eventually found a doorway leading to the staircase. It was held open by a wedge door stopper on the floor, but the lights in the stairwell weren't on at all. I stepped in and looked up from the bottom of the staircase. The whole stairwell was completely pitch black. Not a single light was coming from above, where the room was supposed to be for me to drop this off at. Again, I noticed the eerie silence. A real chill went through me. I was always one to do whatever the instructions say so I'd get good reviews, but this was the first time I told myself that this was way too sketchy. I stepped out of the stairwell and back into the hallway. Just as I did so, the door right across from me opened. The lights in that room were off as well, but a man emerged from behind the door and stepped into the hallway. He was wearing street clothes and didn't look like an office worker at all. The man stood in front of me and pointed past me at the stairwell. 232 is up there, you know. I nodded but didn't move, and neither did he. He just looked me in the eyes with a look like he was suppressing his anger. After an intense few seconds, I dropped the bag onto the ground and started quickly walking to the exit. The man didn't follow me, but I heard his footsteps go into the stairwell and begin ascending upward. As I left the building, I ran to my car. I got the hell out of there. I didn't know what that was or if maybe I was overreacting about it, so I didn't call the police. The following day, though, the police actually called me instead. Apparently, the building had a break-in, and the CCTV footage showed my car and license plate. They tracked it back to me. They also had footage of the break-in itself, so they called me in to question me about any information I might have. I didn't have much to give. I guess it turned out there were actually 3 people inside that had broken in. One was downstairs who I saw, but the other 2 were on the cameras hiding at the top of the stairs, waiting for me to go up there. Disturbingly, several other delivery orders were made to that same office that night. All the other drivers were smarter than I was, though, leaving the orders outside by the front door. What would have taken place in that office had any of us gone up to the second floor is unknown, but hopefully the police can find those 3 men before anyone falls victim to them. This happened to me just over a year ago. I'm 24 and have a townhouse in the suburbs. I live alone, which for me can get really boring. Because of this, I try to have friends over whenever I can. My closest friends come over a couple of times a week, and sometimes even sleep over to escape their parents' houses. I didn't have any plans on this night, but I did have some plans for the next day with my friend Sarah. She was supposed to be coming over to have a movie night. I was really just trying to get this night over with and looking forward to the next day. I went to bed early, about 9:15 or so. In the middle of the night, though, I was suddenly woken up by something. I looked over at my nightstand and saw it was about 2 a.m. The way I'd woken up was so odd. I was immediately jolted up, and my heart was pounding furiously for some reason. My brain was very alert and aware, as though something dangerous was happening. I thought I must have woken up for a nightmare or something, until I heard a click from downstairs. I sat up and heard a door slowly screeching open. I could hear someone's footsteps entering my home. Although terrified, at first I thought this had to be Sarah or one of my other friends. They all had keys to my home in case they needed somewhere to stay. I got up from my bed and walked over to the door. I opened it and stepped into the hallway. "Sarah?" No one responded. I waited there for what felt like forever, but then a bright light suddenly flickered on, lighting up the whole downstairs area. A second later, a soft chattering noise came from the living room. Whoever it was had just turned on the TV. For a moment, I felt some relief, thinking this must definitely be one of my friends. Maybe they'd had too many drinks or something. I went down the stairs and into the living room, and instantly felt my whole body turn ice cold. I saw that it was not one of my friends at all. Some random man was sitting on my couch, turning the TV to a static screen. He looked maybe 50 years old, with patchy long black hair and dirty clothes. As I stared at him in fear, he glanced over to me and showed me a crooked smile. He waved his hand as if to invite me over to the couch. I turned around and sprinted right out the front door. I banged on my neighbor's door until they let me in and called the police there. By the time they made it out, though, the man was already gone. No trace of him at all. What's even worse is that the police didn't take me seriously, suggesting it was probably just some harmless homeless man wanting a place to sleep for the night. The way I see it, everything points to otherwise. He picked the lock on my door to even get inside, sat on my couch and turned on the TV. Then the sick man smiled and invited me over to the couch. I think he may have been a stalker or something, and now I find it hard to even sleep at night when I'm alone. Every time I wonder if there's a small chance that maybe I'm really not alone at all. This happened a few years ago. I was hosting a 4th of July party at my house. It wasn't actually the 4th, but it was the same weekend. I live in a smaller and older house, not far outside of the city. A few coworkers had been to my place before, and somehow I got nominated to host the 4th of July party. There would be over 30 people coming, most likely about 20 coworkers, many of whom were bringing their significant others as well. My house has 2 stories and a small front yard and small backyard. The entire backyard is basically just a patio with a few feet of grass. That's all, really. The backyard is entirely fenced in, aside from my driveway, which leads to an alleyway, then my garage. The property is pretty closed off from my neighbors. I got ready for the party by getting a bunch of food, drinks, and things like that set up. When the day came, a bunch of my coworkers began coming over. It was a nice and sunny day, and people could mingle either inside or outside. I remember that after the party started, things were going very well at first. Everybody seemed to be having a good time. I was outside for a while, but then I went in. I was talking with a few people in my home. When I went into the kitchen, though, one of my coworkers approached me and said that there was a weird guy there. She thought that maybe I knew him and said that nobody outside seemed to have any idea who he was. I was very confused and asked her to show me to this mystery man. We both went over to the doorway leading to the backyard. When we got there, a bunch of people were outside mingling. At first, she couldn't spot him, but she was telling me he was saying a bunch of weird stuff and making people very uncomfortable. Overall, something just seemed very off about the guy. Finally, she located him amongst the crowd and pointed the man out to me. I walked outside to get a better look. The man was somewhat large and had messy hair that went down past his ears. He was drinking a beer as if he belonged here, but I did not recognize this man at all. He was sort of standing by himself in a corner, near where the alleyway was. He appeared to just be watching people. I started walking over to approach the man. I was going to ask him who he even was. When I got about 30 feet away from him, though, he looked right at me. The man instantly turned around and started running away back down the narrow driveway, which went from the backyard past my house into the street. Before making it out of the backyard area, he made sure to stop and snatch another beer out of the cooler, then kept running. I never even got to say a single word to the man. He moved at a swift pace down the driveway and out onto the connecting sidewalk. It was such a strange sight. I figured some random guy happened to be walking by and must have seen there was a party going on, stopped in for whatever reason. The neighborhood was pretty busy and did get quite a few people walking down the sidewalks throughout the day. It was still just really weird, though. I went around and asked a few people about this guy. Apparently, he was approaching people asking very strange questions. I was also told he would stare at a few people in particular and not look away for a really long time. At least he was gone now, though. I was outside for most of the rest of the party to make sure the man would not return, and luckily he didn't seem to. After people started leaving to go home, there was maybe an hour before it was just me. I began to clean everything up. Not a whole lot needed to be done. Just take out the garbage, take in a few folding tables and some chairs, and dispose or put away the rest of the food and drinks. As I was doing this, I walked past my narrow driveway to take some garbage out. When I was on the driveway, I happened to look down it and into the street, and I noticed that standing right in the middle of my driveway where the sidewalk intersected it was the same man from earlier. He was just standing there, staring at me. I didn't know what to do. I sort of waved at the man, but he did not wave back. I continued to take out my garbage, which was at the back corner of my backyard. As I was walking back, I noticed the man moving up my driveway toward me. I didn't know what exactly he wanted, but I stayed there to interact with him. When the man reached me, I said hello to him and asked him what he wanted. The man asked me if he could use my bathroom quickly. I really did not want to let this guy into my home, so I said no. I asked the man why he was at the party earlier, and he denied he'd ever been there at all. Clearly, this was the same guy though. He once again asked if he could go inside my home quickly. I said no to the guy again, but he still didn't leave. By this point, I was getting really nervous. I didn't know what to do or say in this situation. I wasn't quite done cleaning, but I just wanted to go inside and get away from this guy. I told the man I'd see him later, and turned around and started moving toward the back door of my house. When I did, the man followed me. I knew I couldn't go inside right now. I turned and walked in another direction. I figured the man would still continue to follow me, but he didn't. He walked right up to my back door, opened it up, and went inside. When I saw this, I ran inside and yelled at him to stop, but I realized that maybe this guy was dangerous. I went back out to the end of the alley and went to my car, which was parked in front of the garage. I then called the police and waited there until they arrived. When they got there, the man was found hiding in my basement. It really creeped me out. The man didn't try to take anything at all. When I heard that, I really didn't know what to think. I had never seen the man before. I had no idea who he was or why he wanted to get inside my home. I remember back to earlier in the party when he walked away from me after I started to approach him. He seemed to already know I was the homeowner somehow, as he had been talking to a bunch of other people, but walked away from me instantly. That was so odd. I wondered if he somehow had seen me before or something. I'm really glad I didn't go back into my house after him immediately. I'm not sure what the man was truly capable of. I spend the nights working as a security officer. My job is to travel around to various buildings, mostly businesses that hire my company for security. I swing by each of these places multiple times at night, ensuring no funny business is going on and that the building is secure. Honestly, my job is quite boring actually, as you might picture. On a night-to-night basis, not much is really going on around an office building. I'm still required to walk around each entry point of the building though, making sure everything is locked up and secure. I have keys to all the buildings as well, just in case I ever need to go inside for some reason. In the 3 months working this night shift, I never had to go inside a building. However, that all changed during a shift I had 2 weeks ago. I had reached my third building of the night, which was a smaller 4-story office building. I made my rounds around the perimeter of the building, shining my light up at the windows, ensuring they were all intact. I also pulled on each door, making sure they were all locked. I circled around to the back side of the building, and when I did, I was shocked to see that not only was a door unlocked, but it was also propped open. I'd never had to deal with a situation like this before, and quite frankly, I was somewhat nervous to go inside the building alone. Still, I maneuvered my way through the building's interior, moving very slowly, shining my flashlight into every room and corner. It took me a while, especially since I was nervous, but I made my way through all 4 floors of the building, not really seeing anything unusual. I made my way back to the door that had been left open, removing the prop and locking it shut behind me. I continued my rounds, making my way through the rest of the buildings that needed to be checked for the night. I decided, though, to head back over to that office building I'd walked through earlier to make sure that everything truly was okay. I pulled my truck into the parking lot and began walking around the building, doing my rounds once more. To my great surprise, the same back exit was once again unlocked and propped open as well. At this point, I was very confused. There wasn't supposed to be anyone in the building this late, and there were no lights on inside that I could see. I reluctantly entered the office building once again and searched it from top to bottom, this time even calling out multiple times to see if anyone was there. Once again, I heard and saw nothing unusual at all. My entire trip throughout the building was completely uneventful. I didn't hear a single noise except my own footsteps and movements. I returned to the back exit and saw the door was now closed shut. I hadn't unpropped the door when I first entered the building, but now it was closed, and the brick that had been used to prop it open was nowhere to be seen. This was my first time having to enter a building while I had this job, so I was more than a little scared at this point. I quickly left, locked the door, and hurried back to the safety of my truck. Nobody was supposed to be in that building. I was somewhat relieved that I hadn't actually encountered anybody during my rounds of it. It was so eerie to me, though. During both of my searches of the building, somebody had been in there somewhere, evading me, and then even managed to slip out the back door without me ever seeing them. I called the office building's manager the next day, asking if anything important was missing or had been stolen, but nothing had been moved or was gone at all that they were aware of. I still currently work the security night shift job, but I haven't had any nights quite like that one at that office building since then. This is something that happened about 5 years ago now, but I still remember it really well. It's probably the craziest experience I've ever had going to Walmart. During this time, I liked to shop at Walmart quite a bit. I found it to be the cheapest place to get groceries and things like that. I was not a huge fan of this particular store, though. It was often very busy, and I saw a lot of strange and sometimes unsettling things during my times there. One day, I stopped at Walmart after work, which turned out to be a very bad idea. I arrived to the Walmart parking lot at around 5:30 p.m. or so, and right off the bat, things were not looking very good at all. I noticed the parking lot was packed up, and there were cars everywhere. I drove all along the back side of it looking for somewhere to park. As I was doing so, a car pulled out of one of the parking aisles and nearly slammed into me. I had to stomp on my brakes to avoid them. After that, I found a parking space and started to walk to the store. Right when I was about to go across the crosswalk, right in front of the doors though, a car suddenly blew past me. It came within just 5 feet of hitting me. I was a bit aggravated, needless to say. When I walked inside the store, I grabbed a shopping basket and started to head to the grocery section. I really just had to get some groceries. I would be getting 10 different things or so. I noticed there were multiple long lines for the checkouts, and there were countless people walking around inside the store as well. I walked down one of the main aisles in the grocery section, and somebody popped out and slammed into me with their cart. Already a rough shopping trip by this point, but it only got even worse from there. I was at the far back wall of the grocery department grabbing a gallon of milk, when out of nowhere I heard a voice call out from behind me. I saw this little girl, maybe about 7 years old. She had a full Walmart shopping cart next to her that looked like she had been pushing it by herself. The little girl said hello to me, and I said hi back to her. I was very confused. She asked me if I could pay for the groceries for her and her family, because they didn't have any money. I asked her if those really were hers. The cart was literally full. It was easily over $100 worth of items. They were not even all groceries either. There were miscellaneous things mixed in. I said no, I couldn't afford it. I mean, the whole reason I was shopping at Walmart in the first place was because I didn't have much money to spare at the time. If I wasn't worried about saving money, I would have certainly been going somewhere else instead. The little girl didn't say anything back to me. She just pushed her shopping cart away in another direction. I thought this interaction was very strange. What exactly was going on today? I watched to see where the girl would go. The store was busy and a lot of other people were around. I noticed the girl went not that far away to a display with frozen foods. The girl walked up to a woman who I assumed to be her mother. I had to get some yogurt and they were standing kind of near the area, so I ended up naturally moving closer to them. As I was grabbing the yogurt just a few feet away from the mother and daughter pair, I overheard them speaking. I heard the mother say something like, "Now go and ask that man over there." I looked over my shoulder and saw the young girl pushing the shopping cart. She made it over to this random guy who was standing near another section. I saw her approach him and give him the exact same spiel she gave me for about 30 seconds. Then she started walking back. I was thinking maybe they would be able to get somebody to pay for their groceries if their cart wasn't full to bursting, but I didn't like the idea of the mother trying to use her daughter to ask strangers to pay for them anyway. Still, it wasn't really my business. I continued with my shopping and went to another section of the grocery department. I went down several aisles grabbing numerous items. I was almost done now. I would say about 15 minutes had passed since then. I was just about to finish up shopping and arrived near the bakery section. There was still kind of a lot of people around and the store was still very busy. As I was looking at a few different breads, the little girl approached me again. I turned around and she once more asked me to pay for their stuff. I told the girl that she'd already asked me that, and I said I couldn't do it. I leaned in and asked the girl if her mother always made her approach strangers and asked them to pay for their stuff. She said yes. I asked her why, and the girl said so her mom could get stuff for free. After that, I asked her if she liked doing this, and the girl was starting to get visibly upset. Just as she was about to answer, her mother appeared out of nowhere. The mom got between me and the girl and jumped right in my face. She asked me why I was talking to her daughter. I confronted her and asked her why she was making her little girl go up to complete strangers like this. She said it was none of my business, and she was clearly getting very angry. I quipped to the mother that the people might actually pay for them if they didn't fill up their cart all the way. The mother's response shocked me. She became indignant and said that someone had just given them a big pay 2 days prior to this. Made me think maybe she was not so needy at all. After that, I told her to just leave me alone. I started to walk away. That's when the woman attacked me from behind. She rammed into me with all her weight with her cart. It hit me right in the back of my legs and my lower back and was extremely painful. I buckled over, but I got right back to my feet. I turned around and the woman cussed at me a few times. At that point, I yelled at the woman to get the hell away from me. As much as I wanted to get in her face and argue with her, I knew with a person like this that probably wouldn't be a good idea. I started to walk away. By now, several people were staring at the commotion. The woman tossed a few more expletives my way. I walked off, and as I did so, I thought that would be the end of all this. I walked a few aisles away from the woman and tried to just finish up what I came here to do. It was about 5 minutes later, when suddenly I heard something rushing toward me at a fast speed. I looked to my left just in time to see the woman pushing her full weight on her cart and ramming it at me. This time I managed to stop it with my hands, but she still hit me pretty hard. It really banged up my legs, and I could feel the bruises forming already. The woman once again started cursing me out. She actually tried to back up the cart and ram it into me multiple more times. There were quite a few people nearby who were witnessing what was going on. She began shouting at me, and I yelled back at her before some Walmart employees and random shoppers stepped in between us. The argument was broken up for the most part, but the woman would not calm down at all. They had to end up calling the police, who showed up pretty quickly. The woman claimed that I had attacked her, even though she said multiple times she would kill me. It was completely false. After that was pointed out, she got really angry with the police as well, and the Walmart employees. She refused to leave the store, and they had to arrest her. The rest of the witnesses nearby confirmed that she had attacked me multiple times, and that I'd never even done anything to her. I really couldn't believe the whole situation. After that, I was able to leave. The girl, who I think was the woman's daughter, but I'm not even really sure about that, went with the police officers. I felt quite bad for her. Hopefully, she had family or friends who would take care of her and be more responsible than that woman was. After that, I never stepped foot in another Walmart again. This is something that happened back when I was in high school. I'm a woman, and I was a senior during this time. School got out every day at 2:40 p.m. During that time, for about 10 minutes, it would be completely crazy on campus. The school was fairly large, and everybody would be scrambling to get out of there. The lockers and hallways were extremely crowded, and everybody would be in a rush to leave the school. One day, I was able to leave school early. I was in an advanced class during the final period of the day, which only had about 15 students in it. We had a really big test that day, and that was the only thing we had scheduled. When we finished, our teacher said that if we'd driven ourselves to school, we could just leave. Most of the time, even if there was nothing to do in class, the teacher would not let you leave until the bell rang, so this was a nice opportunity. I got done with my test about 15 minutes before class would normally end. I left the classroom and went to my locker. I then walked out to the parking lot. During this time, I parked in the main students' parking lot, which was at the west end of the school, and also sort of behind it. After leaving the room, as I was walking to my car, it felt a bit strange to be leaving without tons of other people scrambling around. Normally, there were hundreds of kids going to their own cars, and there would be a huge traffic jam to leave. Now I could actually take my time. I remember looking around when I noticed something a bit strange. There was this small wooded area at the back corner of the parking lot. I noticed there was a man standing there, right by the side of a tree. He was looking in my direction and wearing these exaggerated sunglasses. It looked very strange, especially because it seemed like the man had just emerged from out of the woods. The guy was obviously too old to be a student, and didn't look like faculty either. I looked back to him. He then ducked behind a tree and out of my sight. I simply continued to my car, got inside, and drove home. I didn't really think much more about it, really. The next day after school, I was walking to my car again. This time, I left school at the normal time with everybody else, and there were tons of other people around. As I was walking to my car, for some reason, I just so happened to remember the previous day and seeing that weird man in the woods. Maybe it was just because I was walking to my car again, but I decided to look over to the woods once more. Surely there was no chance that same guy would be there again, right? But actually he was. The very same man was stood in the exact same spot. It was really hard to see or notice him at all unless you were really looking for him. He was hiding halfway behind a tree. I was wondering who on earth this guy was and what exactly he was doing. I kept looking at him as I walked to my car. For some reason, this man seemed to be fixated right on me. Soon, he disappeared behind a tree again. After that, I simply drove home. It was really strange, but I didn't know what to do about it. I tried just not to think about it until the next day. This time, as I was leaving school, I knew the exact spot to look, but the man was not there. He was not there like he'd been the last couple of days. I figured that maybe it had been a strange one-off occurrence or something. but something strange happened when I left school to drive home 2 days after that. As I was driving back, I noticed this one car seemed to be following behind me almost the entire time. I hadn't noticed until I was about halfway there. It was a smaller black sedan that was right behind me. It wasn't too close, but the car did stick with me going to every area I went, including to where I lived, which was normally a very quiet place. I lived in a large neighborhood, but it didn't get a lot of traffic. I had to make several turns into very residential areas. At that point, we were the only 2 cars on the road. I looked back and noticed in the mirror that the driver was wearing sunglasses. Could this have been the same man? I didn't know, but it sure did seem strange if it was a coincidence. At my street, I turned onto it, and so did the car following me. I wasn't sure what to do, so I just drove to my house and pulled into the driveway. Luckily, the car did not pull in after me. It kept on going. I was very relieved. I went inside, and after that, for the next few hours, everything went pretty normally. I was in my bedroom sitting at my desk later in the evening. There's a window which looked out to the front yard and the street. I remember happening to glance out and seeing there was a man walking down it. It didn't take long until I recognized him. The same man wearing those same sunglasses. The man who'd been at my school and who had probably followed me home. He was slowly walking down our street. I noticed him looking in the direction of my house. When I realized this, I left my bedroom and found my parents in the living room. I told them the whole story of everything, and they went to look out of a front window. At that point, I expected the man to have been long gone, but when we looked, he was actually still right there. He was walking now on the other side of the street, very slowly, and eyeing our house as he did so. My dad left the home and started running over to the guy. I couldn't hear what was being said, but it sounded like my dad was yelling at the man. I saw the guy start running away. He went down the street and out of sight. My dad came back in and said the man got away from him. After that, the man did not come back toward our home again, and I never saw him at the school either. I did report him to my school counselor, so if the guy ever did return, he would probably be caught. I really don't know who he could have been, but I'm glad I saw him out my window that night, or who knows what he would have done to me. I live in what I would describe as a pretty standard apartment. The last one I lived in 2 years ago was very similar to it. The building had a few basic hallways and tons of units. I had a parking space in the underground garage, and there were several apartment buildings in the complex. This was about right in the middle of my lease, when I had been living there for about 6 months or so. Weird things began to happen. My apartment was on the second floor of the building, kind of towards the end of one of these hallways. One night, I was awoken to the sound of banging on my door. This happened to be a Friday night at 3 o'clock in the morning. Somebody was repeatedly pounding on my door, and it seemed about as loud as they could muster. I laid there in bed and waited for it to stop, but it continued on and on. After about a minute straight, I decided to get up. Once I made it out of my bedroom, though, the knocking stopped, and I could hear somebody walking away down the hallway. I went to the peephole and looked out, but the person was already gone. I didn't really want to open the door and look out into the hallway myself, so I just went back to bed. I didn't hear any more knocks or anything that night. The next day, I was thinking about it, remembering being woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning. I figured at that point it was probably somebody coming home drunk from the bars or something. It made perfect sense to me. It had been a Friday night. Probably just got back and started banging on a random door, either to mess with somebody or because they accidentally went to the wrong place. I really wasn't that concerned about it. Sometime next week, though, it happened once more. I woke up to someone pounding on my front door, and I had a bad feeling about this. Not knowing who this was unnerved me. I didn't really know any of my neighbors, so I couldn't be sure if it was one of them or somebody else. This time, I did not get up at all. I just waited for the knocking to end, which took maybe 20 seconds or so, roughly. When it finally ended, I stayed up for another hour. I really wasn't that tired anymore. I was able to get back to sleep a while later, but this was pretty annoying. Several nights went by before it happened once again. This time it was a little earlier though. I was still wide awake and in my living room watching TV, when all of a sudden there was a knock at the door. It seemed normal at first, but then it turned into that same kind of loud banging. I was so confused. What was going on? I really didn't want to get up and check, so I just stayed on my couch. The knocking lasted for 15 seconds or so, and then stopped once more. I once more heard the person walking away, and the rest of the night nothing more happened. A few weeks later, I had almost forgotten about the whole ordeal. It hadn't happened in quite a while. Then it began to randomly happen once again. This time, I was already awake once more. I was in the living room, and it was pretty late, sometime after midnight or so. I sat on the couch in the living room when I heard a loud pounding on my front door. It wasn't like the other times, though. It was crazy how hard they were banging on it, almost like they were trying to break it down. I stayed where I was like usual. This time the knocking lasted a bit longer, almost more than a minute. I decided to get up and look and see what was going on here. I walked over to the door, and it was like the person had heard me. When I got within a couple feet of it, the knocking stopped, and I could hear their footsteps moving away. I looked through my peephole and saw they'd already escaped seemingly. I opened up the door this time and looked out into the hallway. When I did, I actually saw someone there. It appeared to be a man walking away, but I could only see his back. He didn't turn around and look at me or anything. He just started moving away even more quickly. I only saw him for about 5 seconds before he reached the door that led to the stairs and began running down it. I went back inside after that. For the rest of the time that I lived there, I never heard any more suspicious knocking. I have no idea who that guy was. I didn't recognize him at all, and he was clearly not one of my neighbors. Why he always chose to knock on my door specifically, I have no idea. It really gave me the creeps, though. I used to work at Subway years back. The job was exactly what you would expect, and I liked it quite a bit. I remember something really creepy happened one time, though, and I still randomly think about it here and there. One time, I was working a closing shift. I think we closed at around 9 p.m. or something like that. I'd been working since sometime in the afternoon. Our Subway location was in a pretty good spot and would get really busy during certain times. At around 5 p.m., it started to get busy once more, and by 6, there were lots of people in line. I remember that I was kept very busy during this time. I was making sandwiches back and forth on this night. I believe there were 3 of us working. 2 of us would be there until closing, so we had 2 people making the subs and 1 person on register. Even with all this, the line was somewhat long for quite a while. I remember that the restaurant was overall very crowded. At some point, I looked up and noticed this guy in line that was just staring at me. It wasn't like he was just looking around randomly or happened to be looking in my direction, but it was a very intense and purposeful gaze. I didn't recognize this guy at all, and I didn't look at him for very long before looking away to focus back on what I was doing. Sometime later, about 5 minutes or so, I looked up again randomly and noticed the man was still staring at me. I looked away again. I was not looking forward to when it would be his turn in line. 10 minutes went by and I didn't have to make a sandwich for the guy. After a while, I looked around and noticed he was not even in line anymore. Unfortunately, he was still inside of the restaurant. He'd stepped away and was just staring at me. I looked away again and tried to focus myself on work. We were all so busy that I really didn't have the time to point him out to a coworker or anything. I barely even had the time to wonder why this guy was staring at me. I just knew that I had no idea who he was or why he would be looking at me. Finally, a while later, things quieted down a little bit. I realized the man was still there. I decided to take my break, so I went into the back for a while. When I came back out to work again, the man was gone. I thought that would be the end of it at that point. I only had a couple more hours of work left, and things were very quiet for the rest of the night. There were a few customers here and there, but not very many at all. Now it was just me and another coworker that was there until close. At probably 20 or 30 minutes before closing time, I remembered that the guy had come back. This time, though, he was outside the restaurant. There are big windows at the front of the subway, and the man was just staring inside at me. When I noticed him, I got so creeped out. During this moment, I was alone behind the counter. My coworker had stepped into the back. The man outside was just watching me. This was several hours after he'd last been seen inside. I was so creeped out by this that I went into the back to grab my coworker. When we both came back out, though, the man was already gone. We closed up a short time later without getting any more customers. When we left, I looked around the parking lot for the guy, just in case he was hiding somewhere. It didn't seem like he was around, though, or at least I didn't notice him. We left after that without incident. I was a part-time employee, so I didn't work every single day. I don't think I worked for the next few days after this incident. When I returned to work, I did not see the guy again. I still don't know who he was or what he was doing. I'm a groundskeeper at the cemetery in our town. Despite popular belief, the job usually isn't that creepy at all. The only thing I find unsettling about the place is the couple of bells that are still left by some of the gravestones that have been there for almost 2 centuries. Most nights, though, nothing at all happens, and I just go about my routine. Sometimes a group of kids will show up and mess around, but as soon as they see me, they always run off. Since our town is relatively small, this is the only cemetery within several miles. Because of that, the graveyard is actually pretty big, so it can fit all the stones. This was on a Thursday, in the middle of summer. I'd shown up at 10 p.m. like usual, and went into the small brick building that we called the Outpost. It was a single room, with some security screens and general maintenance tools, as well as a small bathroom. To start the night, I grabbed the keys and walked down to the main entrance gate. I locked it up. While I was there, I noticed a man walking in the grass on the other side of the gate. He was wearing a black hoodie and was just walking along the fence only a few feet from where I was. I waited for a minute and watched him walk past the gate and continue along the fence line. Seeing as he was not really doing anything else, I went back to the outpost. I put the keys back on the wall and stayed inside for half an hour while I looked over some things. At about 11 p.m., I grabbed the key to the runner and went out to get it. It was a small ATV with a basket on the back for us to use when doing yard work. I pulled it out and started making my rounds to each headstone, making sure there were no damages, and picking up any flowers or other things left behind. We do this every Thursday, since most funerals are over the weekend. That way, people will have time to collect their items if they want to. Most people just leave them in remembrance. Anyway, I drove around and collected some of the flowers, putting them in the back of the runner. That was when I saw a figure on the other side of the yard. Immediately, I looked around for any more people, trying to see if this was a group or only a solo person. It appeared to be just the one guy. I started driving over to them, but even with the sound of the ATV, which was pretty loud, the guy didn't even look at me. He just stared ahead as he kept walking through the yard. I thought maybe this guy was in distress from a recent loss or something. I pulled up right next to him and tried to be polite at first. "I'm sorry, sir, but the graveyard is closed until tomorrow morning. I can give you a ride out if you need it." He continued walking, not even looking at me. I pulled up beside him again. This time, I didn't go as easy on him, though. "You have to leave now or the cops will have to get involved for trespassing." He finally stopped and looked at me. His eyes were red and wide open, bulging out of his head. He was smiling. It was a sad kind of smile. I don't know, but it really creeped me out. There was a couple of seconds where neither of us said anything. All of a sudden, the guy lunged at me. He grabbed onto the side of the runner. I sped off as he was dragged forward a bit, and then had to let go. I quickly turned around and headed straight for the outpost, calling 911 on my radio as I did. I parked the ATV outside and went into the security room, continuing to inform the police on the situation. The department is only a couple of minutes away, so I hunkered down in the outpost and started looking through the security cameras to get any info on where this guy had gone. Before I could even find him on the screen, though, a loud thud shook the door behind me. The man began to throw his whole body against it, as though his very life depended on getting inside. It was enough to shake the floor and walls of the small building. There was nothing to defend myself with, so all I could do was watch the door violently shake and hope it would not give in. I quickly checked with the dispatcher, and they told me to hold out just a little longer. Officers were only a minute away. Maybe 10 seconds later, the banging suddenly stopped, and I heard the man sprinting away. I looked back at the screens to see which direction he'd gone in. As soon as the officers arrived, I told them where he'd run off to. After a quick search, they did not find him. The way he'd gone was towards a bunch of trees, and there was no way to know how dangerous this guy was. Chasing him any further into the darkness was not a good idea. I made an official report and everything, but the weeks went by and nothing was found. I don't know if he was just in a fragile state of mind from a recent passing or what, but whatever happened that night likely won't ever have any answers. I was living with my brother at the time in a very small 2-bedroom home. It was really outdated and in a bad part of town. Both of us were saving up to move out and get away from this area. Thankfully, we were able to a few months after this event happened. At the time, though, I was working overnights at a hospital, and my brother worked mid-shifts at a grocery store. Because of this, we rarely saw each other for more than a quick hello or goodbye. It was my day off, and since I worked overnights, I usually tried to keep my sleep schedule the same. I woke up at 8 p.m., had breakfast, and greeted my brother as he came home from work. A couple hours later, he went to bed, and I stayed in the living room watching some Netflix and relaxing. Not too long into the show, though, a light suddenly beamed into the room from outside the front window, almost as if someone was pulling into our driveway. I got up and went over, looking out to see what was going on. I saw that a car had parked right behind mine. Their lights were still on and blocking any view of who was inside the vehicle. I didn't have much time to look, though, because just as suddenly as they'd pulled up, a knock came at the front door. I was immediately aware of how odd this was, even more so because it was pouring outside. When I looked out the front door, a man was standing there in the rain, just outside of the porch area. I didn't know if this person was from the car, and maybe he'd just gotten out really fast, or someone else entirely. Either way, obviously I was not going to answer the door to this suspicious person. I went back to the window and waited. A couple minutes later, the man by the porch walked up to the car and got into the passenger seat. Then they backed out and drove away. I thought that was really weird. Maybe they had the wrong house or something. I sat back down and started watching my show again. I didn't really even give it much thought after that. I mean, they'd already left. I spent what I think was the next hour laying down on the couch. At some point, I dozed off, though. I must have not been asleep for long, maybe 15 minutes at most, because the TV was still on and the full episode hadn't even played through of the show I was watching. I paused it and sat up, taking a sip of water and trying to shake off the sleepiness. After a moment, though, I realized the rain was especially loud. I turned my body and looked at the front hallway. The front door was cracked wide open. A rush of panic ran over me. I ran over and looked at it. I knew I'd locked it before, so the only explanation I could think of was that my brother had woken up and gone outside for some reason. At least, that's what I was hoping. In the back of my head, I was thinking about those people who'd showed up earlier, though. I closed and locked the door, then called out for my brother. The house was quiet aside from the rain impacting the roof, and my brother did not respond. I started walking up the staircase and looked down the hallway. The door to his room was open, which was really odd if he was still sleeping. As I got closer, I could hear what sounded like multiple people moving around in his room. Just as I came up to the doorway, a man rushed out, knocking me over and continuing down the hallway. Another man followed him, running around me and down the stairs. As I scrambled to my feet, my brother came out of the room and said to call the police right now. He chased the men down the stairs. I was dazed at everything happening so suddenly, but I did as he said. I followed behind him and the two intruders as they ran to the side of our home and down the road. My brother locked up everything behind them. While we waited, he said they'd woken him up and held a knife to him to keep him from talking. He said all this happened only a minute or so before I woke up. When they heard me coming upstairs, apparently they got flustered and ended up just running. They never said why they were there or what they wanted. Whether it was a planned attack on us specifically is not known either. It seems to me like they were targeting my brother in particular, but maybe they just didn't notice me there on the couch. It's hard to say exactly. Like I said though, we moved out soon after this occurred, and after that, nothing else happened. One time last year, I went to a Subway at night. I was just going to get a sub, and the Subway restaurant was only about 5 minutes away from home. It was located in a quiet strip mall that had several other businesses in it. I went there at about 8 p.m. or so. I remember that it was completely dark out because it was springtime. The area was also pretty quiet. Most of the other businesses in the strip mall were now closed. I walked inside of the Subway and I ordered my sandwich. It didn't take very long because nobody else was in there. As I grabbed up my sandwich, I remember that when I was getting a drink from the fountain, I noticed a man passing by on the sidewalk outside. The man was somewhat tall and had shaggy-looking hair. He was wearing a t-shirt and sweatpants. I remember that he looked in the window at me as he was passing by, but continued walking on his way and out of my sight. After I got my drink and everything else, I left the Subway. I was walking to my car in the parking lot when I heard somebody begin approaching me. There were footsteps a little behind me and to my right. I looked over and saw the very same man. He was approaching me, and before I knew it, the man was right next to me. I stopped to see what this guy wanted. When I did, he asked me if I could give him a ride over to the gas station and pointed in the direction. The way he'd pointed, there really was a gas station within sight. It wasn't that far away at all and was kind of in the direction where I lived too. Obviously, I did not want to give this man a ride since I didn't know him or anything though. I said to the guy that I was in a real hurry to get home. As I started to walk away though, the man followed and said it wasn't that far away. He just needed to go to the gas station to meet a friend there. Eventually, I said yes and told the man I would give him a quick ride. I feel stupid even saying that. Obviously, it's not smart to give a ride to a random person you meet at night for the first time, but that's exactly what I did. I was just hoping it would be a quick drive to drop the man off. I mean, it would likely take less than a minute to get to the gas station, and it was within sight. It was just a little bit to the left of the strip mall and almost behind it. The gas station was open, and there looked to be several other cars there. The man got into the passenger side of my vehicle, and I got into the driver's seat. After getting inside, the man was quite polite and nice, and said thank you to me. He said that he was really cold and didn't want to walk all that way. It was pretty cold out with it being early spring and nighttime, so I figured the guy was telling the truth. I left the parking lot of the strip mall where the subway was and drove onto the busier street. After we went to the left, the gas station was just off to the right. The entire drive there, neither me nor the man said anything. It was just some awkward silence. After I turned in, I pulled into a parking space on the back side of the lot. It had been a quick and easy drive. When I stopped though, the man did not make a move to get out of the car. I said something like, "All right, have a good night now," but he still didn't get out. It was really awkward. I began to get a bad feeling about this whole situation. At this point, I was kicking myself for letting a stranger get in my car at all. Finally, I just said to the man, "We're here. Isn't this where you wanted to go?" The man spoke and said this wasn't the correct gas station. He said it was another one that was a ways down the road and pointed to the east. That was not the direction I was going. I had thought the man needed to go to this gas station. In fact, I'm sure that's exactly where he had pointed earlier. I told him this is where I thought he was going, and he said no as if I was stupid for thinking that. I told him I was not going in that direction, and he had to get out now. He didn't respond and didn't get out either. The man seemed to be growing angry with me, that I somehow didn't know exactly where he was going. I told him I could not go there, and I wasn't going any further with him. He did not seem happy about this. He still refused to leave my vehicle. The man demanded I drive him to the other gas station. I was getting pretty nervous. I didn't know if this guy could be dangerous or something like that. I asked him to get out of my car once more, and again he said no. At this point, I wasn't really sure what to do. As we were sitting there, I noticed a police vehicle pulling into the gas station. When I saw this, I was thinking that maybe I should try to get the cops' attention. As I was still thinking that, though, the man next to me suddenly opened my car door. He jumped out and took off running. The guy started heading towards the building. I just left and went home. I told myself I would never let a stranger into my car again. Looking back, I'm not entirely sure what the guy was planning to do. I figured that when he saw the cop, though, he knew that he was up to no good and decided he had to cut his losses right there and then. I'm glad the officer just happened to pull into the parking lot when he did. This is a bizarre experience I had a couple of years ago. During this particular time, I was looking for a new apartment. I'd been living with a roommate in this really run-down, beat-up old place. I had recently got a new job and finally had a little money to get a place all to myself. A place that would be much nicer as well. The kind of apartment I wanted did not have to be perfect, but I certainly wanted something better than I currently had. This would only be my second apartment that I ever got, the first by myself. I was quite excited about it actually. I looked online for the new place. I was still pretty new to living in this general area, and had moved in from another state when I got my apartment with my roommate. I went on to an apartment search website, put in my budget and preferences, and looked through all the results. After looking through some of them online, I selected one that I wanted to take a tour of. It seemed like a really good deal, and looked decent from the pictures provided. I contacted the management for a tour. I filled out some forms and was ready to look the place over a couple of days later. When the time came for the tour, I drove down to the apartment complex, which was about 10 minutes away. After entering the building, though, I was fairly unimpressed. I realized that I may have made a mistake here by even selecting to have a tour. I had pretty much already made up my mind that I didn't want to move here. Overall, the place really didn't look any nicer than where I currently lived. The pictures online were technically real, but they sure dressed up the place a whole lot better. Still, I got out of the car and met my tour guide, which happened to be the property manager and landlord, I think. Really, he did just about everything he said. We met, and he said he would give me a tour of the unit. The people within had just moved out. I went inside with him. The whole building smelled old and musty inside. The carpet was old and beat up. There were spider webs in all the corners, some with spiders in them. There were even some in the cupboards. The guy was talking really good about the place, as if it was super nice. He mentioned that he lived in the unit next door, and we would be neighbors if I moved in. I was nice enough and stayed there for the whole tour. When it was over, the guy asked me if I would take the apartment. I said I had to look at some others first, but would let him know if I wanted it. He did the old salesman technique, saying that he had a bunch of other people interested in the unit. He even said that he had it on hold from them so I could tour the place. I didn't know if that was true or not, but I knew that he was trying to pressure me. He said he had rearranged things just so I could take this tour, so he hoped I would take the place. I simply told him I could not agree to it right away, and if he had to give the apartment to somebody else, then so be it. I had to look at some other ones first. The man seemed disappointed, but we said our goodbyes. I left, and immediately after that interaction, I knew this was not where I was going to be moving to. I went home and continued my search. I decided to raise my budget. I realized that I could actually afford something a lot nicer than that dump. The next day, though, I received a call from the landlord of the apartment I'd just looked at. I answered, and he asked me if I was going to take the place. I told him I'd decided I was not going to, and would be looking elsewhere. The man sounded very angry. He said that he had it on hold just for me, and claimed he had lost other renters because of it. I told him that I never knew that, but I'd also never made him a promise I was going to move in there. I simply wasn't going to do it. After that, the man continued talking, and tried to convince me. I still said I wasn't interested. I honestly had no desire to live there, even if it was free, especially knowing this guy would be my next-door neighbor. The guy tried to ask me why I didn't want to move in exactly. I found it strange just how persuasive he was trying to be about this. I made it very clear that I did not want this unit. I said bye and hung up on him. It was all very strange. Pretty unprofessional, to be honest with you. It would get even more unprofessional from then on. That evening, the guy called me again. I don't remember the exact time, but I think it was around 7 p.m. or so. So strange. I couldn't imagine what he could possibly want from me now. I didn't answer it. When the ringing ended, he did not leave a message or anything either. The next morning when I woke up, I noticed my phone had actually been called several other times. He had called in the middle of the night at like 2 a.m. I was hoping this was just an accident, but this time he did leave a message. When I played it, he simply said that he really needed to get a hold of me and to call him back right away. I blocked his number and thought that would be the end of it. I would never see him again or hear from him again. The story is already strange enough as it is. A couple of nights later, I was at home with my roommate. I was in my room, and sometime at night, maybe 8 or 9, there was a knock at the door. I didn't know who it could be. Maybe somebody there to see my roommate? I knew that I certainly wasn't expecting anyone. I stayed where I was, but a few moments later my roommate came to my doorway and asked if I'd invited some guy over. I said no, and she said some random guy was at the front door. At first, I really had no idea who this could be. I walked over to the door and looked through it. The same guy was standing there, the landlord from the other apartment building. I had no idea what he wanted from me now. As I was standing there, he continued to knock. I shouted from the other side, asking the man what the hell he wanted. He asked if he could come inside. I said no, and he said he would only come inside for a minute or two. I said that if he didn't leave now, I was going to call the police on him. The man began to curse at me and kick at the door, then stormed off. After that, luckily he did not come back. I don't know why that guy kept bothering me. I figure he must have got my address on the forms I had to fill in to look at his apartment. I wish I'd never looked at that place at all. I ended up getting a much nicer place a short time later, and have been living there since then. I thought I'd share a creepy story that happened to my dad and his cousin when they were young. Now, this was about 20 years ago, and wasn't really in seclusion, but nonetheless, it is pretty disturbing. When my dad was young, he would sleep over at his cousin's house during the weekends. The house was all one floor, consisting of the front door entrance attached to the living room and kitchen. The living room had a long hallway for the bathroom, his aunt and uncle's room, and then the bedroom where him and his cousin would sleep. His cousin's room was pretty small, with only a bed, dresser, and closet. The bed was pressed against the window, so when they slept, they would face the closet and the doorway. One night at around 3 a.m. or so, my dad recalled seeing shadows emerging from the closet and tried to wake his cousin up without any success. He didn't see or hear anything else afterward, so he fell back asleep eventually. The next night, my dad heard a noise coming from outside the window, just behind the bed. He woke his cousin up successfully this time, and they ran to the bedroom where the aunt and uncle were sleeping. When they went to check, nothing else happened for the remainder of the evening. A couple of weekends later, my dad was over for another sleepover, and here's where it got real scary. At some point in the night, around 1 a.m. or so, my dad once again began to hear something from the closet and saw more shadows moving around. Something he saw that night must have freaked him out more than normal though, because he started screaming, and all of a sudden, a man just sprinted out of the closet, down the hall and out the front door. His cousin woke up, as well as his aunt and uncle. The cops came and did some investigating, but they never ended up finding anything. The assumption was that some creep had been sneaking into the house and hiding in his cousin's closet. The window behind them was an easy lookout for the creep to look in and inspect the area. Overall, it gives me chills whenever they tell me the story. They seem so frightened of it still to this day. I live at the base of a mountain, which is fairly secluded. No humans really go there, except for me and other people from my family. One summer evening, I decided to climb up to the top, which takes about 2 hours. I set off with my 3 dogs. When we got to the willow maze, which is exactly what it sounds like, basically a field of willows with little trails and very limited vision, the dogs started to act quite weird. While they would usually run ahead on the hike multiple times, this time they stayed right by me and seemed very anxious. Their anxious energy rubbed off on me, and suddenly I felt like there were eyes on me. I could hear rustling in the bushes. And that's when I heard a faint laughter of a man nearby, and that's also when I decided to get the hell out of there as fast as humanly possible. When I got home, I told my dad, and he told me there had been a murder in that area not long ago, but he didn't want to tell me unless he had to, on fear of scaring me from going out ever again. Nowadays, I try to stick to my regular route and avoid that creepy but beautiful willow maze. I love caving. I absolutely love it. I even joined a caving club. They send you an information packet once a month about featured cave tours. One month, they sent out a packet containing a 7 to 8 hour wild man caving tour. I've been on wild man tours before, and they're not too difficult. Maybe some rappelling or mild climbing. Nothing over an hour though. This one had some real danger. Climb too much to the right and you get stuck. Slip too far and you can fall in a hole. Getting rescued in a deep cave is basically impossible. There were 5 of us, 3 tour guides, me and another person. About halfway through the cave, they let us rest on this shallow ledge thing that was right next to the biggest drop-off of the cave. The guides told us how with larger groups, they did the typical total darkness and had everyone turn off their headlamps and just look around. When he motioned for us to follow suit, we did so. After about 30 seconds in the darkness, though, there was this sound. Honestly, it sounded like footsteps, then falling rocks, and finally a screech of terror. Immediately, the head guide flipped on his headlamp and looked around us with a panicked glint. He thought one of us had fallen or jumped off the edge. He turned to the other 2 guides and asked if they'd heard it as well. They did, but they couldn't explain what it was. They hadn't moved at all, and the 2 of us were still there. He radioed to the surface and asked if any of the other tours were missing anyone. This was about 3 hours away from the start of the Wild Man path, and without our headlamps, it was literally like staring into a wall of black. There was no way an inexperienced or even an experienced caver would have made it that far by themselves. The guides asked us if we wanted to continue with the experience and would understand and refund us if we decided not to. We went along and eventually did complete the tour. Everything else was perfectly normal. I have no idea what that could have been. It certainly wasn't animal footsteps, and that screech was blood-chilling. My family has a cabin in a remote area of the Rocky Mountains. There's this one particular hike nearby that we would always go on when I was growing up. It took you up a large hill, cut down into a ravine, and took you down to an abandoned mining cabin. It was really cool, and the cabin itself was full of old antiques, books, cans, furniture, you name it. Last summer, I took my SO on the hike to show off this cool abandoned cabin to them. It had been about 5 years since I'd last been there, and it took us quite a while to find the trailhead because it was so overgrown now. We hacked our way through brush, and luckily I had a really good memory for the general direction we should be going in. As we were heading down the ravine, we saw the roof of the old cabin. Excited that we'd found our way through all the brush, we started to head towards it. Once we went inside, though, it was completely different than the last time I'd been there. Instead of the cool old furniture and antiques, there was some sort of nest. The nest stretched from floor to ceiling and across 2 entire walls of the cabin. The most unsettling thing about it, though, was that the nest appeared to be made of bones. Not small bones either. There were big ones. One was the size of a human clavicle even. I immediately had this terrible feeling and wanted to get the fuck out as soon as possible. We booked it out of there and ran up the ravine as quickly as our dog could keep up with us. We reached the top in less than 30 minutes and were at the top of the hill where we could look down and see the cabin below. We stopped to catch our breath at the top, which was fairly flat and had a lot of visibility. I decided to use that moment to try and get a signal on the satellite phone from the high point. I got a hold of my mom and we were having a quick chat. I kept on hearing this strange noise though. It was off in the distance and I couldn't quite make it out, but my SO was hearing it too and getting increasingly uncomfortable. I could finally make out the noise eventually, and I realized that was because it was getting louder and closer. It appeared to be the sound of 2 metal objects being clanked together, like someone banging a spoon against a skillet or something. My dog started to get super defensive and started snarling and barking in the direction of where we'd just hiked out of. Now we were completely freaked out. I hung up the call, we grabbed our packs, and ran the rest of the 2 miles back to our cabin. We reported our experience and gave our photos of the cabin interior to a local forest service, who concluded that the nest was most likely a bear or cougar den. The noise we heard following us out of the ravine, though, will haunt my nightmares for years to come, especially because they concluded it was totally unrelated. We had this huge family event where everyone would take off for 2 weeks and go camping. The campsite took 7 hours to get to, and was/is one of the most popular places to go camping in my state. I was around 16, so I brought a friend with me. We stayed in the tent together because we like to stay up late and freak each other out. Well, one night, I woke up having to use the bathroom. The outhouse was near the end of the loop, so it was about a 5-minute walk to get there. I woke my friend up and we headed over together. As we were heading back though, we heard this scream that sounded quite far away. We figured people were having fun over near the cabins or something, but decided to investigate and headed out to the lake. When we got out there, all we could hear was coyotes going insane on the other side. We ran like hell back to the tent. Those damn coyotes were going crazy for the next 30 minutes. Then it was complete silence. That is, until we began to hear something walking around our tent. We could clearly hear whatever it was sniffing around. It plopped down on the outside of our tent. You could see the outline of this huge figure there. We could hear heavy breathing, and then this huge growl as well. It did not sound like a bear to me. It stayed there all night, sniffing our tent and lying next to it. We were completely terrified. Of course, we couldn't scream for help either. That would just startle whatever this was and cause more problems. Eventually, we fell asleep out of terror, and whatever it was had left by the time my family emerged from the camper. I know it was probably a bear, but the sound was much different than you'd usually hear. We found out the screaming from earlier was from an actual bear encounter though. Some couple came out of their camper to find a bear tearing up their campsite. They weren't smart enough to hide the food, or stay inside the camper apparently. I often spend weeks alone in the woods by myself. I used to go on group trips about 2 weekends a month. For 10 years or so, I was practically born into camping, and I really love it. Most of my outings are trips to the Ocala National Forest in Florida and other state or national parks. Most of my odd occurrences are with other people and animals. I've stumbled into neo-Nazi rallies or clan gatherings several times, multiple interactions with the odd hunter and their tracking dogs as well. Last year, however, finally opened my eyes to the danger of being alone. I was heading to my usual spot in Akala, a free primitive campground next to a secondary creek. That was when I noticed a Department of Corrections bus. The officer there stopped me and briefly inquired about my reasons for being there. I asked what was going on because I was going to be camping in the area. He said a body had been discovered by the road and was linked to a case in the area. He and the prisoners were there to search the surrounding area. The case was being built for a local man apparently linked to the murders. I left the scene and went home, rather than camping out there. While I was on the way back, though, I was thinking the entire time about an occurrence that happened last year when I was alone in my tent. I'd heard footsteps outside. Assuming it was a bear, I pulled the slide on my handgun loud enough to be clearly heard. Rather than an animal noise, though, I was startled by a response of the whispered hush of a man's voice, laughing. I thought back on that and realized I'd narrowly avoided becoming a part of that case myself. The man was later caught and arrested and linked to a ton of murders in the area. I think he's still serving time in prison now. I went on a date with a guy from Craigslist. I was 17 years old at the time. I put up an ad looking to meet someone. I don't remember the exact details. A guy responded who lived close to me, and so I emailed him back and gave him my number. He was actually one of the only ones who responded without a creepy message. He said his name was John and that he was 26 years old. This guy John and I spoke for 2 days before meeting. We met on a Friday night. We texted back and forth and he asked if I was single. I said yes, and he asked what kind of food I like to eat because he wanted to take me to a restaurant. I asked him a few questions about himself, and he told me he still lived with his mother but had the top floor all to himself. He was a part-time model, and that made some pretty good money. Judging by his picture, him being a model was a fairly believable story. Friday night comes and John comes to pick me up. He drove a silver 2-door car. He texted me and said he was waiting outside. After checking my hair and makeup one last time, I said goodbye to my parents, telling them I was heading out with friends. Then I left and got into John's car. The first thing I noticed was that he actually looked exactly like his photo. He had pale skin with dark hair and dark eyes. He looked a little bit older in person, but not that much, and he made up for it with snappy fashion sense. Actually, he looked kind of cool, and he was incredibly kind as well. His body language and smile totally put me at ease. Yes, it's really stupid to go on a date you met on Craigslist, but surprisingly, this guy was really normal. We chatted for a while as he started driving away from my hometown towards the highway. He wanted to drive us into the city to go to dinner, which wasn't too far away, only around a 25-minute journey. John started to reveal more details about himself to me on this journey. He told me he was embarrassed to tell me he lived with his mother, that I might think bad of him for not having his own place at his age. John got closer and closer to the highway. I can't tell you exactly what it was. I won't make it up because I don't exactly remember. There wasn't anything creepy going on either. I just suddenly felt put off by him. You know when you're on a date with someone and you're not quite sure, and then they tell you something that's your biggest turnoff? It was that kind of situation. Again, he didn't say anything too creepy, just was very off-putting. As we're getting closer and closer to the turnoff, I tell this perfectly nice guy that I'm really sorry, but I don't feel like going to dinner anymore. I'm not feeling very well. John's initial reaction was one of sympathy. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" Am I driving badly? I told him I just didn't feel well. Well, John then kept asking me, what did I say? What did I do? I told him it's not him, it's me. I wanted to go home because I really felt ill. Okay, well, let me just drive you around for a bit before I take you back. I don't want to end the evening just like this. I knew without him driving me home, I'd have to walk over an hour, maybe more. So I told him that driving around for a second seemed like a fine idea. Instead of him turning around and heading back towards my house though, he veered off and started heading to the town I knew he lived in. I should mention it was pitch black out, and the town where John lived was surrounded by dense woods. This wasn't even worth mentioning if you took the highway and the proper turnoffs to get there, but instead he decided he wanted to go via the back roads because it was more scenic, despite the fact I couldn't see a thing. John had gone from being incredibly talkative to almost completely silent now. He kept driving further into the wooded area. A few times I'd ask him questions about himself to break the awkward silence. At one point I even put my hand down on his knee affectionately, trying to regain the friendly, flirty banter we'd had just moments before he blanked me. For the most part, he occasionally answered with soft grunts or nods. It was like he was having a tantrum or something. John pulled into the parking lot for the forest. It was around 9 p.m., so naturally it was totally empty. He slowly drifted along, looking around for other cars, then parked the car right at the end closest to the woods. There was no one else around. I hadn't even seen anyone pass us. No other cars on the way to get there. For 10 minutes he just sat there, staring into the darkness ahead. It was disturbing. I think I managed to make small talk for about 5 minutes, which is a long time when someone isn't saying anything back. I then joined him in his silence. I was afraid of appearing fake. I didn't want him to think I was scared. So some time of silence goes by, when abruptly John gets out of the car, closes the door, and locks it. I was stuck inside. His lights were on, so I could sort of see ahead in front of the car. There was a field that went on for about 20 feet. Then beyond that were trees and dense forests. To the left was the rest of the car park and the exit at the far end. To the immediate right was some more forest, with a small path. John disappeared into the area ahead. I tried the handle on the door, but it wouldn't open. I began to rationalize this away. Maybe he'd accidentally locked the door. I was telling myself that if he really wanted to do something, he would have stayed in the car. With no sign of John, I decided I needed to call someone. I looked around for my phone, only to find that I could no longer find it. This was an old silvery pay-as-you-go flip phone. I was confused that I couldn't find it, because I had put it right next to me. After looking for it for a good few minutes, it became sure that he had taken it with him. Mind you, I didn't want to start rooting around his car in case he might be watching me. I didn't want him to catch on that I was freaking out. At that point, I started looking for my phone with only my eyes, instead of making it obvious that I was petrified. My eyes were darting all around. There was nothing there. I looked up and squinted into the field and forest ahead. I saw John. He was standing about 10 feet from the car in that small field. He was standing and smiling, but it wasn't a friendly smile. He looked terrifying. This was not the same guy I got into the car with earlier. I looked ahead and smiled back. I was still trying to act like his behavior was normal, like nothing he was doing was scary at all. Still smiling, his tongue began to protrude from his mouth. He stuck it all the way out, then began wagging his tongue up and down while maintaining eye contact with me. I felt myself trembling. I was trying to compose myself, not taking his eyes off me, and with his tongue still out, he started unzipping his pants and then began to urinate in front of me, all while staring me dead in the eyes. This is the point I found it difficult to act like I was in on his behavior. I looked down at the floor, not wanting to watch what was in front of me. He didn't creep or slink back to the car. Instead, I heard his thundering steps and then a slam against the window. I guess at this point I was the luckiest person alive because another car pulled into the parking lot. I don't know what this did to John, but immediately he got back in and laughed at me. Normal laughs like earlier, like nothing had been wrong. "So what music do you like? I'll put it on while I drive you home." He did drive me all the way home. When he pulled up to my house, I went for the door, but it was still locked. "I want you to promise me something," he said. I asked him what it was. If you ever see me after this, turn the other way and act like you don't know me. If you see me with my family, don't you dare say a word. I don't expect to bump into you, but don't say anything." I agreed and then asked him, "Have you seen my phone?" He told me no. I guess my phone was a small sacrifice for surprisingly making it home okay. When I got inside my house, I said goodnight to my parents and went upstairs to my room. I then turned on my computer. I wanted to gather as much information about this guy as I could. Back then, I used MSN Messenger, like AOL Instant Messenger, and logged in automatically whenever I started my PC. Now, before I get to the final part of this story, it's important that you know this. One day before, I had been at my best friend's house. We had the kind of friendship where it was like who could pick on the other the most. It was all in good fun, and mostly we just made minor fun of each other and had a big laugh. The day before, my friend had changed 2 contacts in my phone. She replaced the contact mom with the guy I had been texting back and forth with. I knew immediately she had done this because I saw the previous messages come up. I didn't change the numbers back at the time, thinking I would just do it later. When I logged into my MSN Messenger, I had a ton of messages from this guy and a few from my best friend. When John had locked me in the car, he had taken my phone and texted my mom, which was actually still this other guy. He had texted them, "I'm sorry, but I decided to move on. I found someone, so please don't look for me. I'm happy being left alone." The guy I was texting knew this was a big red flag. He responded and texted my phone back saying, "I don't think this is you. I know where you went, and I'm calling the police." Incredibly quick thinking from him. He had absolutely no idea where I was. I think his text saved my life that night, and it explains John's sudden change of behavior. Maybe it wasn't the random car that pulled into the parking lot. Maybe it really was that text. I worked at Six Flags last spring/summer. Well, technically a freelance arts company leasing vending spots there. I was one of the oldest people hired, being 18 at the time. I just started attending college, while most of my other coworkers were still in high school. I took photos in a sort of old-timey dress-up shop. It was honestly one of the most fun jobs I've ever had. I was hired back in March of 2018 and started work in April. This was when the park was open on weekends only, before the official opening. I had been working for about a month, and the park was now open during the week as well, for less than 10 hours per day. I was able to work all day long pretty much, but was unfortunately the only one in the shop, as college was on summer break, and high school was still in session until mid-June. I'm sure you can tell where this story is going. I was alone all day during the weekdays, and only had coworkers on the weekends. I was so terribly alone during the day that I'd just walk across the path and watch my other coworkers doing things out of boredom. When I was outside of my shop area during the day, I began to notice that a man had started hanging around my area. I'd mainly see him walking by very slowly and staring at me, not blinking the entire time. I figured he was just a shy guy that wanted a picture inside and was too afraid or socially awkward to come in and speak to me. Deep down, he did give me an uneasy feeling, but I decided to ignore it. He was a customer in the park, and so far he hadn't really done anything to me. I kept a smile and tried pulling in more customers all day, every day. One day, I smiled and waved at him. That was probably my big mistake. He walked over briskly to stand in front of me and just kinda stared at me. I was creeped out and kind of scared of this guy, honestly. After like a full minute of just staring into my soul, he asked about the prices. After days of walking by and staring at me, I breathed a sigh of relief and started going through my memorized sales pitch. After I finished, he started to smile. It was not a normal smile though. It was the kind that makes your skin crawl. He leaned in so close to my face that I could smell his breath. He asked how much it would be for him. I was confused as I'd just gone through my price list, so I stated that the prices were set and non-negotiable unless you were an art company employee or a park employee. He shrugged and just walked off. As I ran through my pitch to others during the day, a family had grown interested and wanted to take some pictures. I gladly took them into the shop and had a wonderful time photographing them. While I was checking the family out and collecting their payment, I looked up and saw the man was back. He was leaning against the chain barrier in front of my shop. The family collected their things and walked over to the chain. The man had to move to the side for me to open it for them. I immediately closed it behind them as he tried pushing his way inside. I told him I was sorry, but only paying customers could come in. He wasn't allowed to do so unless he was considering a purchase. He frowned and walked away. I waited a few minutes, tidied everything up, and stepped back outside to continue working. It was almost closing time, so it was kind of pointless, but I had to stand outside and try to get more customers anyway, or else I'd get in trouble with my boss. I noticed the man one additional time that day. Across the way from me was a kind of carnival game or something. I could see him hiding behind it, peeking his head out and looking at me. I can't tell you just how eerie that sight was. He continued to do all of this for the entire week, and eventually I just learned to ignore him, which apparently he did not really like. On that Friday, as soon as the park opened, he startled me by making a beeline towards me. I was out front organizing outdoor props, and I froze. I hastily dropped what I was doing and went back inside, closing the chain behind me. The man paced back and forth in front of the store, muttering to himself and looking at me. I was so terrified, I was going to run to the phone and call security. He suddenly lurched forward, grabbing the chain in both of his hands. I'll never forget this moment. His eyes were completely wild, and he had that same menacing grin. He started whispering about the things he wanted to do to me. It was disgusting. He started ranting about how much he loved me, and we were meant to be together. How he wanted me to put him in a dress and humiliate him in front of all the people in the park. I was slowly backing up to the wall in my shop as he started laughing and yelling hysterically. I told him to go away and that I was going to call security. He got even more angry and said something that still keeps me up at night to this day. Even if you do, I'll be waiting for you when you get out. Meet me by the employee exit on your way, or else. He gave me that same disgusting smile and walked away. I went behind the counter and tried to compose myself. I never imagined I'd have something like this happen to me, let alone at work. Now that I had, all my knowledge of what to do went out the window, and I started crying like a little girl. I decided to tell my manager at the end of the day because I didn't want to be afraid of coming into work. When I told him, he was completely mortified that I hadn't told him sooner. He walked me to a secret exit of the employee parking lot so I wouldn't have to deal with the man. The next morning, we went to the security office, and I gave a description to all of the park security of what he looked like and what he would normally wear. I went back to my shop with 2 coworkers. Not even 5 minutes later, there he came strolling over with an angry look on his face. I hadn't ran into him last night, and he was furious. My coworkers noticed my panic as I ran and hid in the back. I hadn't told them about my situation yet, and when I did, they told me they would not leave me alone even after their shift was over, so the guy couldn't get to me. I called security and told them what he was wearing, so they updated the information. They posted an officer outside my shop as well. The man seemed to disappear because of that. When the officer had to leave to take care of something for a moment, though, he immediately came back. Security realized that every time a clothed officer was around, he would hide away, so instead they posted a plainclothes officer across from my shop, posing as a customer. I was being used as bait ultimately, but I felt it was important to get a guy like this out of the park. Security eventually apprehended him later that day as he was heading towards my shop again. They asked me for identification on him, and I remember breaking down and sobbing. The officer comforted me. Finally, the nightmare was over. He never physically threatened me or wielded a weapon, I guess, but he was doing enough verbal threats to make me fear for my life. They banned him from all Six Flags parks in the country, revoked his membership status, and took him into custody as well. Unfortunately, as there was no violent acts committed, they had to let him go. As I drove home that night, I saw him walking on the side of the road. I immediately sped away, in fear he would see me through the window and try to do something to me. At least he couldn't get to me at work anymore. I found a couple of weeks later from one of my security friends that he saw my stalker being arrested in a town over. I went and looked up the public arrest records for that town later that day and saw he'd been arrested for indecent exposure, public endangerment, and public intoxication. I know what happened to me might not be as severe as some other stories, but it was one of the most terrifying weeks in my life. You really don't think something like this will happen to you until it does. I'm a woman and am now 23. This happened around the time that I was 15 years old. I've had a couple of encounters that have been very creepy, but this one had me shaken to my very core. Around this time, it was my sophomore year of high school. A little backstory to understand the story I'm about to tell. At the time, I was kind of going through a phase, as most teenagers tend to do. I wore short shorts most of the time and fishnets as well. My shirts weren't really tops that a 15-year-old should wear, I think, but we still do. I cringe at my outfits back then and my makeup, but that was just how it was. I was involved with my high school color guard. We're a part of the band, except we don't play instruments. Instead, we spin colorful flags. We also used rifles and sabers in our performances. Around this time, it was the fall, and we were practicing our show. We were doing a lot of reruns to try and perfect it before the usual competitions would start. Normally, practice would start at 4 and end at almost 9. Side note, I did not live close to my high school like most people that went there. The drive would take at least 15 minutes. Walking from my house to school would take about an hour, and taking the bus would take 45 minutes. My brother at this time worked late hours, and my parents didn't get off work until midnight. My next best choice was to take the bus home. The neighborhood was not the worst, but it wasn't safe enough to be walking home alone at night. Even before this night, I had always been a little bit on edge going home. On this particular night, I was saying goodbye to my friends and not wanting to bug them for a ride, so I walked over to my bus stop. I had my cell phone out and was scrolling through Facebook. I would occasionally glance up and check out my surroundings when I noticed a car slowing down in front of the bus stop. It immediately signaled to make a turn to my left. I didn't really think that much about it, since there are houses behind that area. It wasn't that weird until I noticed this car doing that again and again and again. I get scared easily and am already a paranoid enough person, so this had my alarm bells ringing right away. It wasn't until he had basically passed me by for the 7th time in a row that he parked on the curb by the bus stop. That's when I got a better look at him and took in his appearance. This happened a couple of years ago, so my memory is not perfect. I do remember he seemed to be Hispanic and reminded me a bit of an uncle of a friend of mine. His first words sent me panicking. To translate what he said to me in Spanish, it was basically him saying, "Hey, come over here. Do you need a ride? Hop in, I'll take ya." He kept saying that for 5 minutes like a robot, then just drove off. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding in. I was trying to calm myself down and tell myself that that was it. But I knew it wouldn't be, and I was unfortunately right. His car showed back up not long later. The thing about my bus stop is that there's a bunch of houses right behind it. Before the houses is a good amount of space with only dirt. Cars can actually go in this area, and I've seen it before. For some reason, it shocked me to see him drive around the back and park right behind me. At this point, I was panicking, and tears were falling down my cheeks. I was already thinking I'd never see my family again, because this man was surely going to try and take me. I was frozen in place. I already knew that in crucial moments like this, my reaction is to freeze, not fight or flight. Freezing is what I do. I still believe it was the prayers I was saying that saved me. At the exact same time the man began to approach me, these two big bulky guys walked close by. They appeared to be walking their pit bull on a leash. I'm a sucker for dogs, but at this time I couldn't speak or say anything. I was still in my frozen state. I knew this was my only chance, and I fought to get those words out. They kept catching in my throat. It was my only chance to save myself, so I spoke out in a shaky voice. "Excuse me, please, can you guys stay with me? That man over there won't leave me alone. I'm very scared." My words were choked up, and I was shaking at this point. The guys were very kind-hearted, thankfully, and agreed to stay by my side. To come off as more intimidating, they even crossed their arms across their chest and flexed their muscles. They stared down the man, who at this point got back into his car and began reversing. He drove off, and the guys stayed with me until my bus arrived. The time when this all ended was 9:59. I know some of you might be asking, why didn't you just go back to your high school? Well, at this point in night, no one would really be there. Mostly everyone else had already gone home. I did have a cell phone, but no one was going to be able to pick me up. The bus was my only transportation at that time, and I didn't know that Lyft or Uber existed. Actually, I'm not even sure it was a thing back then. Overall, I'm just happy to have been saved that day by the kind-hearted men. I hope one day I can see those guys that stayed with me and thank them for what they did. Because of them, I'm still here and able to share this story of mine. I'm still shaken up at the memory because of the scare it gave me. After that incident, I asked for a ride for the remainder of that season. Sometimes, even when you don't want to bug people with things, it doesn't really hurt to ask. It's better to be slightly annoying than to find yourself in a bad situation. You can always apologize to your friends, but you can't come back if something bad happens to you. This happened a few months ago in the beginning of summer. I've held off on sharing it for so long because I didn't want to be judged for my actions. I joined a stupid online dating app. I divorced just last winter. I was kind of living it up, you know. I somehow matched with this man who lived in New York, an 8-hour drive away from me. After texting for a few weeks, he sprung it on me that he was going to drive down to see me. Since I'd been staying with my family ever since the divorce, I decided we'd get a hotel. He told me to find one and he'd pay for it. I already felt super bad that he was driving so far, so I was trying to find good deals and the cheapest place that wasn't sketchy as fuck. I live about 40 minutes outside of the city in the state that I live in, and I'm not super familiar with some areas. The hotel I booked ended up being no bueno, but I didn't know this until I got there. It was dark by the time I arrived after getting lost 4 times. There was a very shady motel across the street, with 2 men smoking cigarettes on the porch. Lots of trucks and truckers traveling through too. I was walking into this hotel thinking, well shit, I fucked up. I just went with it anyway though, because I didn't really have a choice. NY, what we'll refer to the man as, was about an hour away, so he'd be there pretty soon. The hotel was run by Jamaicans, I think a whole family. This comes into play later, which is why I mention it. The woman who checked me in was fairly nice, but the whole place just gave off some weird vibes. The lighting, the heavy smell of bleach, the strange carpet, I don't know. It was really bright but also really dark, if that makes any sense. I started shaking as I was trying to check in. The reservation was under NY's name. At first, she told me she couldn't find it. His last name was Spanish, so I thought maybe I was pronouncing it wrong, even though I'm pretty good with my Spanish. This made it awkward, because now she knew I was meeting a stranger. I thought maybe he gave you the wrong name, she had said. I nervously chuckled. She put me on the second floor. I was expecting an elevator, but as I turned, I saw that behind me was a huge carpeted staircase. I get to my room and just pace around, waiting for this stranger from the internet to show up. It started raining. I was sitting by the window sipping a glass of wine when I see a pickup truck pull up. I think maybe it's him. A man in a black hoodie gets out and locks his truck, about 50 beep beeps or so, then runs inside. I started panicking, thinking it was him. He had no bags or luggage. Maybe he was just coming to kidnap me or something. There was a loud knock at the door. I jumped hard and immediately stood up. I made my way over to the door and looked through the peephole. It was NY, no black hoodie, carrying all his bags with him. I cracked the door and smiled. He came in and I shared my terrifying thoughts with him. We chuckled and had a laugh together. Sex happens, of course. Later that night, we were falling asleep. He was spooning me, but also had his arms all the way around me, with his head on top of my head. I was awoken from a dead sleep, sweaty because he was holding me so tightly. I thought that was what had woken me up, but then I heard it. Someone was fucking with our door. I heard the handle moving, as whoever it was tried to open it, but it refused to budge. NY jumped out of bed so fast, I wondered how long he'd been awake, listening to this to react so quickly. I pulled the covers up to my chin, as he was standing in the dark in his undies looking at the door. He looked through the peephole and said he thought it was one of those Jamaican men who worked there. We had a chain on the door, as well as the locks, so he kept the chain on and opened it a few inches. Before he could even ask what the man wanted, the guy just called out, "Is the white girl in there?" I remember getting chills all over my body. NY said no and slammed the door in his face, almost completely unbothered by this. The man said something about needing a credit card from me. NY yelled back that the room was on his card under his name, and he'd take care of it in the morning. I looked over at the clock and it was 2 a.m. I turned over and stared at the wall, hoping to fall back asleep. NY wrapped his arms around me again and immediately started snoring in my ear. Good thing he was hot. The next morning, we decided to get some breakfast. It was super early, and we were both feeling groggy from last night. I'm hoping that as we round the corner to the stairs that no one is at the front desk. They definitely heard the noises from our room, and I was feeling really embarrassed. That was when I saw him. An older black male, standing a few feet from the exit. Honestly, I don't know if he was Jamaican or if he was part of the family who owned this place, or a guest or just someone else. I don't know. His face was sunken in, and he had a weird chilling look in his eyes. He was staring right at me. I knew without even seeing him last night that this must have been the same guy. NY whispered for me to just keep walking, so I broke eye contact with him and leaned into NY as we made our way towards the exit. As we passed by, the man was silent. Then, as I'm pushing the door open to exit the building, he suddenly calls out, "There's the white girl. I found the white girl. She makes a lot of noise." NY snorted, but I was terrified. I left for work after breakfast. I was gone a few hours and returned to the hotel to find the room empty. I texted NY and asked where he was. He texted back saying he was in the laundry room and he'd be right back up. I sat down on the bed waiting for him. I heard some footsteps outside the door, the floor creaking, like someone was standing out front shifting their weight back and forth. I figured maybe NY forgot his room key, so I got up to look through the peephole, only to see it was not him. The creepy man from before was standing outside the door, just staring in through the peephole. I jumped back and started crying. I called NY and yelled for him to come to the room quickly because the man was outside the door again. He was gone by the time NY arrived. He went down to the front desk and spoke to the woman about this man. She just kept saying she had no idea who he was talking about and that she would keep an eye out for him. That night, obviously, I had a hard time sleeping. I felt like I could feel him lingering around outside the door, but I was too scared to go and look to check. NY was, of course, sleeping soundly. He was still a stranger, but he was the most comforting thing I had. We checked out the next morning. I grabbed his hand as we made our way down the stairs, because guess who was standing right there? Yeah, the woman from the front desk was now gone, replaced by a younger male. The creepy man was smiling as we neared the bottom of the stairs, his awful, bone-chilling grin. "Lucky man with a white girl," was the last comment we heard from this creep. NY spun around and told him to fuck off, then walked me out to my car. He waited while I drove off to make sure no one followed me. I don't know, maybe there's more we could have done. But again, the guy didn't actually do anything technically. It was just a very unnerving experience. About a month later, I was telling my dad about it. He laughed and told me I had picked the worst part of the city. He thought he'd heard about this place being shut down multiple times for either drugs or sex trafficking. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.